Welcome to Malpractice Podcast.
So, are you ready to get started?
I almost did it too. Yeah, I'm ready to get started.
Ready, Freddy.
Ready, Freddy.
I'm Jess.
I'm Sydney, and this is Malpractice Podcast.
This is Malpractice Podcast.
This is the home of all things.
No. Who are we today?
I don't know, honestly. I'm fine with whatever you want to be.
Yeah, this is the home of.
The home of whatever you want us to be.
Well, within reasoning.
Within the parameters of what we're capable of.
And what we want to do.
So, yeah. Oh, I ran a half marathon yesterday.
And what happened to you?
And I stress fractured my foot.
Yep. And now?
So my foot is now in a boot.
Yep.
For 4 to 6 weeks, which is
awesome.
Great. So if you hear any unusual dragging or scraping or bumping, it's because I have a new cyborg leg and I don't know how to use it yet.
Imagine you're just dragging it around.
Pretty much, yeah. I was talking to Eric and I was like, you know when you hear someone's heels clinking down the hallway and they sound really like a sexy shoe because they're like tick 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 tick.
Yeah.
Well, my foot sounds like thump, scratch, thump, scratch. Like I sound like a pirate walking down the hall.
You should get one of those scooters.
One of the
scooters where you put
your knee up.
Your knee and then you scoot around.
Yeah, with a horn on it. Like I honk at people in the grocery store.
I mean, why not?
Why not?
You're not going
literally.
to the grocery store, right?
No.
You do curbside.
I think I've been to the grocery store one time since the beginning of the pandemic.
I just love going to the grocery store.
I hate it with a fiery, hot passion.
I like it.
There has to be one person in every relationship who is okay going to the grocery store. And for us, that's Eric.
Oh, yeah.
Does Michelle hate going to the grocery store?
Yes. I think Michelle hates going to the grocery store with me.
Uh-huh.
Because she is so, she's so focused. So she's
Same.
like, boom, 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 boom. And I'm like, well, maybe I should go down the cereal aisle. I don't know. That's me.
Yep. Eric does the same thing. He's dawdling around in the grocery store.
Yeah, that's me.
And I'm there for business only. I'm like, let's get in, let's get out, let's go home. Also, Jess and Michelle sent us cookies after we ran our half marathon, and it was delicious.
And I addressed it to who?
Cat mom and cat dad. So the delivery person, rang our doorbell. And Eric went and opened the door. He was like, hi, can I help you? Because, we didn't really know it was coming. And she was like, yeah, I'm looking for cat mom and cat dad. Could that be anyone in this house?
I think it's so funny.
Eric goes, absolutely, that's me. Thank you. Yeah. We beat our expected times. I think I was the 441st woman, which doesn't sound great, except that there were 11,000 women.
No, that sounds good to me.
Right? I felt really good about it.
Even if there was 442 people, if you beat one person,
you're a winner in my mind.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
In the Houston Chevron Marathon this year, the woman's name is Kira Diamato. She set a new record for women running a marathon in America.
Damn! How fast does she do it?
Her time was 2:19.
2 hours?
For 26 miles. 2 hours and 19 minutes, yeah. Let's be clear, my time for the half marathon was 2 hours and 20 minutes. That means she ran the marathon in approximately the same time it took me to run the half marathon.
Damn, that would have been the same amount of time it took me to run a 10K.
Literally. They had a celebration for her because she made a new record. It was so cool.
She's a runner. She's a track star.
Yeah, but they're 50 million. There's 50,000 people there, so it's a big event.
And now everyone's
so we're also getting tested for COVID. Yeah. Yep. You want to get into the interview today?
Yeah. like, happy to do that. So we talked about the Milgram Experiments because Sydney did an episode on them a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think we reached out, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
to an author that is like a shiny star. And she said yes to being interviewed. So we are going to share a conversation we had with Gina Perry today.
Yeah.
She is an Australian writer, a science historian, and a registered psychologist, although she's not practicing right now. A full member of the Australian Psychological Society, APS. Already more than I'll ever do in my life.
She's so cool, yeah.
Her feature articles, columns, and essays have been published in newspapers and magazines, including The Age, The Australian, Cosmos, and New Scientist. Her co-production of the ABC Radio national documentary about Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments beyond the shock machine won the Silver World Medal for a history documentary in 2009 New York Festival's Radio Awards. So she's cool. Yeah.
She's so cool. And you should absolutely check out her book, which I think I referenced when I did the
You did.
Milgram Experiments episode. I referenced her book, which is also called Behind the Shock or Beyond the Shock Machine. She was a runner-up for the Bragg UNSW Prize for Science Writing in 2013, and her work has been anthologized in Best Australian Science Writing 2013 to 2015. She obtained a PhD from the University of Melbourne, jointly undertaken in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies and the School of Culture and Communication. And she's an associate in the Faculty of Arts. We're so excited to have her on the podcast. Everybody check out her book and welcome Dr. Perry, or as she told us to call her, Gina. And if you haven't heard our episode on the Milgram Shock Experiments, definitely go check that one out.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gina Perry, and I am a former and currently non-practicing psychologist. I'm a science historian. I'm a freelance writer. I've been a journalist and fiction writer, and I'm based here in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm an associate in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne, where I did my master's and my PhD.
Wow.
That's an amazing career.
Yeah. Which one of those is your night job? Which one's your day job? Which one's your superpower?
Well, for a long time, my day job was psychologist. I worked particularly in vocational counselling. I got to the point where I'd spent so much time working with young people and often staff in colleges who were having that moment of doubt about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives and who they wanted to be. I thought it was probably time I asked myself the same question. And I'd always, I had always wanted to write, and so I decided to do a writing course. That was it. The work that I've ended up doing, I guess I've really found my own niche, which is an absolute passion for research, for kind of oral history in a way.
Yeah. And
combining that with, I hope, writing that engages and inspires people, I hope. I know that sounds grandiose, but, I'm always struck by the fantastic stories there are buried in journals and academic articles. And I think, that could be a fantastic job, would be just to go through some of those journals and rewrite those stories for the layperson, because that sort of way of getting information out and knowledge is really, I think, is very exciting, turning relatively difficult and dense subjects into engaging and alive stories that just make you want to read on.
Science communication is a field that is so undervalued in science. And so Dr. Perry's book is Behind the Shock Machine, the untold story of the notorious Milgram psychology experiments. And I would just like to hear kind of a general summary, if that's okay, from from your research and your perspective about Stanley Milgram and the Milgram experiments.
Okay, so a little bit about Stanley Milgram first. He obviously was a employee at Yale. He was a assistant professor. He was 26 years old when he conducted the experiments in 1961. It was his first major research project, and he received funding from the National Science Foundation. And he initially framed it as an exploration of the idea of mind control, because 1961, the Korean War and the whole scandal about the brainwashing of American POWs was still in the uppermost in a lot of people's minds. So that was his initial approach. But then, of course, there was the trial of Adolf Eichmann.
Mm-hmm.
And Milgram was one of those people who did draw inspiration from things around him in everyday life. He, like a lot of Americans at that time, would have been watching the Eichmann trial, which was televised across the US, and sensitised a whole new generation to the atrocities that occurred during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this sort of confluence of things, I guess, for Milgram. There was that he was 26, he was ambitious, he was in a tenuous position, you know, at Yale, not permanent, wanting to make his mark and wanting to do research that was important and relevant. And so those things coming together, he came up with the idea of doing an experiment about basically exploring this notion that Eichmann put forward as his alibi during the Nuremberg trials, which was that Eichmann was accused of orchestrating the transportation of Jews to the death camps. And Eichmann's argument in his defence was that he was simply following orders. He was not a mastermind by any means. He was simply a cog in a bureaucratic machine, a small cog who was just playing his part. And so Milgram's experiment was to explore that, was to bring people into his lab. He advertised for volunteers in the local newspaper. Those volunteers would arrive at the lab one by one. And when they arrived at the lab, they'd meet an experimenter called Mr. Williams, and they would meet another volunteer. And the volunteers would draw lots for roles. And the idea that the experiment, as it was explained to them, was that it was an experiment about memory and learning. And when they drew lots for the roles, one person would draw the lot of teacher and the other would draw the lot of learner. The learner would be seated in a machine. Generally, this is a description of the most famous variation of the experiment. The learner would be seated in front of a machine and strapped into a chair in an adjoining room. And the teacher would be taken into the laboratory where they were seated in front of a large machine with 30 switches on it, each switch increasing in incremental voltage, 15 volts per switch. And it ranged from 30 volts to 450 volts. And the groups of switches were labelled from mild through to severe and then extreme danger. The person playing the role of the teacher was told that they had to teach the learner pairs of words, and then they would test their memory. So they would read the first of the word pairs, and then they would give the person four options, like a multiple choice. Which of the following four words matches the original one? And it was a test of learning, and that each time the learner in the room next door got an answer wrong, the teacher had to give them an electric shock. And with every wrong answer, they had to increase the voltage on the electric shock. So that was the basic setup of the experiment. And in Milgram's description, he talked about how the experiment was tightly scripted by the experimenter. With the increasing levels of shock, there would be a point, I think around 150 volts, where the learner would cry out or make some noise of discomfort and pain. And thereafter, those cries and complaints would increase in intensity. until at around 400 volts, the learner would fall silent. And the implication was, well, what was the implication? Was the learner passed out? Were they dead? The teacher was seated in front of the machine, instructed to go ahead with the test. And then, of course, there was always a point where teachers would turn to the experimenter and express some kind of discomfort about what was happening. And according to Milgram, the experimenter had 4 prompts that they used, and only 4. And those prompts were, please continue. And then the next time the person tried to pull out or hesitated, you must go on. And again, these 4 prompts increased in intensity. And the final one was, you have no other choice, teacher, you must continue. Now, if someone still, after the 4th prompt, refused to go on or said they wanted to withdraw, they were deemed to be a disobedient subject and the experiment was discontinued. And what Milgram reported in his first journal article was that 65% of people went to maximum voltage on the shock machine. And the implication that he drew from that was that the majority of us will slavishly obey orders from authority and inflict pain on a stranger.
Yeah.
Because we have this innate tendency to merge our will with that of a higher authority figure, which, when I put it like that, sounds kind of not crazy, but I kind of feel like, why didn't we push against that conclusion?
Yeah.
And yet I think in a way why we don't, and why I certainly didn't when I first heard about it, was that when you hear about the Milgram experiments, I think, particularly as a psychology student, you're kind of identifying with the experimental team, not with the subjects. And you identify and you think about the value of the research.
Yeah.
You think about the value of the discipline that you're engaged in, because it is, I do think, and I know other scholars have made this point, that experiments like Milgram's are a terrific example to new recruits in the discipline of psychology and social psychology about the power and value of the work that they're involved in.
Yeah.
So it's very seductive in a weird way, but when you look at it, particularly what was so striking to me was I really do think that when you look at primary documents, a lot of the difficulties with research become obvious, and we do rely too much on secondhand and textbook accounts. If you go back and read Milgram's first journal article, there are things that jump out at you. And I'm not just saying that since I did my research. I think if I'd done it right at the very beginning, I would have asked some of the same questions that I did end up asking.
Yeah. It's wild. When I heard about it, when Sydney presented this topic, I was like, there's no way. I think, to your point, that people identify with almost, the zookeeper, not the zoo. Like, there's no way I would do that. I would never shock anyone, and I don't want to believe, right, that 60% of humanity would do that either. But it touches a nerve, right? The reports touch a real nerve with people and kind of shock people, or I don't know, almost like gamify humanity in a way. How can you explain that to me? Like, I think immediately that Milgram's just a bad guy.
Yeah.
I quickly jumped to that conclusion. Is he the bad guy in the story? Is he a good guy? Is he both? What do you think about that?
There's certainly, I do think there's something about the perspective that we take when we hear about the Milgram research, where secretly we think, well, I'm not one of those 65.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of element of feeling special or different.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
And distinguishing yourself from the herd. I think that's part of it. It's complicated, but I do think there's an element of that that it feeds into a kind of moral superiority that we feel in relation to other people. But there's sort of an element there of watching things happen that we're glad we're not part of and we feel superior to.
It's like watching a train wreck. Everybody likes to watch a train wreck.
Yeah, definitely. And also that's the power of the experiment, is that it is counterintuitive. And that was a big mark of the success of experiments at that time, was that somehow they upended our expectations and that gave them that extra oomph. And it was what Milgram's colleagues and contemporaries were taught was the value of research, was that it was newsworthy, basically. I mean, I found a lot of parallels between the power of the research as a story is the same as the same way that you would pitch an article to an editor for a newspaper or a magazine.
Yeah.
This has got interest, it's got drama, people can connect to it. So, it's no coincidence that Milgram's research, and also you look at Phil Zimbardo and the Stanford prison experiment, they have a life in popular culture because of their media coverage and the depiction of them. Yeah. So Milgram intuitively understood that. He was very, very alert to that, I think, and very clever in his presentation of the research. Whether or not he's a good guy or a bad guy, I am wary of that question, because I know there are scholars who believe that you can be completely objective and that you should be about your subject. I found that I had to be very aware of my own feelings as I interviewed people who were involved in research, because I did feel Hannah Bergman, I called her in the book. She's the only person whose real name I didn't use. And the other man I interviewed was Bob Lee. Both of them, I felt like I had to do quite a bit of explaining and debriefing in a way. And I resented that bitterly, actually. I felt it was very wrong. I felt it was very wrong that the experiment had never been explained properly to them, and yet they were living with the experience and the trauma of it decades later. And for me, it wasn't just that Milgram hadn't debriefed them at the time, and certainly by the time he got to the end of the experiments, 9 months later, he was debriefing people.
Yeah.
But these particular two missed out on that experience. So that was wrong. But I think the other thing that I felt very strongly about was the way when he met with subjects, Milgram was very reassuring. He tried to normalise what they did. He talked about them in terms of being like nursing staff in a hospital who would have to give subjects injections, knowing that there was slight pain involved, but there was going to be it was for their benefit.
Yeah.
So he normalised it, but then he wrote about them in terms that were derogatory and would have been very humiliating for people, for example. And when his book came out in 1974 and he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, like a lot of the depiction on screen of Milgram's research, the program began with the footage of Nazi troops marching and then footage of people in concentration camps. So these people in New Haven were being framed against that background.
Yeah.
Of course, a proportion of them were Jewish subjects. And because Milgram did so little screening, he didn't do any physical screening of subjects. So he had no idea of whether or not there were people who were coming into his lab who might, for example, have a heart problem themselves or some kind of physical disability. He also he had information about whether or not they'd served in the military or served in the armed forces, but he didn't have any information about whether or not they'd actually been victims themselves or survivors or,
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about people who would have had family members who had died in World War II at a minimum.
Yep.
Scholars will use Milgram's own family background as a kind of introduction to his interest in the Holocaust, which is totally understandable. But Milgram did not offer that same, I guess he didn't acknowledge that as an issue for his own subjects. And so we are getting into that whole territory of how social psychologists had to, in a way, dehumanise people in order to conduct their experiments. And I think Milgram struggled with this because in his private writings, he did agonise about what he was doing to people, as he should have, and but he never published that, and his public speaking about his subjects was quite at odds with some of his private worries.
Yeah.
But I do think that, the way we refer, and I say we because I do think that psychology, in the way that it talks about its subject matter and the people involved in experiments, is kind of dehumanising. It's a way of reinforcing an idea about scientific objectivity that it actually masks a kind of a callousness, I think.
Yeah.
So just to go back to your question, was he a good guy or a bad guy?
Yeah.
That's a bit too simplistic for me, but I did absolutely have moments where I felt that Milgram needed much closer supervision than he had.
Yeah.
That as a 26-year-old researcher, it was really, he was very much left to his own devices, and I think that was the responsibility of those around him, that they'd not taken responsibility and not intervening earlier. So, I think he was in a difficult situation, and I think in a lot of ways, he was his own worst enemy, but I also think he was allowed to get away with it.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether you're, how you feel about him personally, I think you can look back on his experiments and recognize that there was scientific error in the way that he conducted and then reported the experiments. And part of what I found so interesting about your book is that it really reframed the findings in a way that changes what you should take away from them. And I'd love to hear, if you don't mind telling us and our listeners about some of the things that your research uncovered that the public didn't necessarily know about the Milgram experiments.
Sure. So when I described the Milgram experiments earlier, I made the point that I was describing the most famous and well-known version of the experiments, and that is where the teacher is in one room, the learner is in another, and the teacher has no visual contact with the learner during the experiment. All they can hear is hear them. Now, that version involved 40 subjects. And that was the basis on which Milgram claimed in his first journal article that 65% of people will obey orders and go to maximum voltage on the machine. That was shocking to me when I discovered that it was only 40 people, because one of my first research questions was, where does the 65% come from? When I looked at the material at Yale, and when I looked at his book, because he describes it in his book as well, although the book is missing critical information, but Milgram actually conducted 24 different variations of the experiment. Mm-hmm. Each variation had a different script, it had different actors, and it got different results. So, for example, there was a variation where the learner and the teacher were seated in the same room, and the learner was seated just slightly behind the teacher. And so the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner were in the same room. There was another variation where the experimenter was supposedly called away and left the teacher to conduct the experiment by themselves with just tape-recorded instructions. There was another variation where there was a group of teachers together. So there were 3 teachers, only one of whom was the real volunteer and the other 2 were actors. And the other 2 would either pressure the volunteer to increase the shocks or they would hang back. And so Milgram was testing all kinds of variations to see what affected degrees of obedience or disobedience. And of course, when we use those terms, obedience and disobedience, we should actually, and I tried to do this in the book, I tried to not use those terms. What he was measuring was someone's hand on a switch. So he operationalised that as obedience or defiance. But what actually motivated someone to press that switch or not press that switch, I don't think was nearly as straightforward or simple as simple obedience or defiance. He had 24 different variations, and in total there were around, I think, 720 subjects involved in these experiments, and there were 24 of them. So it was very hard to get a single statistic because it was like comparing apples and oranges. I mean, each variation was different.
Right.
So that was my first difficulty with the statistics of Milgram's research. I could see why he claimed that 65 because it was true of that particular first journal article. But taken as a whole, what I found was that Milgram had actually conducted an analysis that he never published. He had a research assistant called Takedo Murata who did an analysis of all 23 variations and found that in 18 of 23 experiments, those people who believed that the learner was really getting painful shocks gave lower levels of shock than subjects who doubted the shocks were real. So the overwhelming conclusion from Milgram's unpublished research was that the majority of subjects disobeyed when they felt the learner was actually being hurt. So for me, that was a really, that was another moment in my research where I was looking over my shoulder and around me for anyone who I could talk to about it because it just seemed so incredible. What we've been led to believe is actually, on the contrary, what Milgram did not publish was his own conclusion and his research assistant's conclusion that the believability of the experimental scenario affected whether or not people went to maximum voltage on the machine. And I found a lot of evidence in the research in the archives from people about scepticism about what was happening. And I don't mean by this that people were definitely convinced. There were a lot of people like Bill Menold who were very torn at the time, but that they knew something wasn't right, but they couldn't put their finger on it, and they got out of the lab later and thought about it and thought, of course. But I do go back to Bill Menold, and one of the things that haunted him really was that night he went straight home from the experiment. And his next door neighbour was an electrician, and he didn't go straight to his house. He went straight to his neighbour.
Right.
And he said, could I have hurt this person with this machine? This was the voltage that was described on the machine. Because he'd been introduced to the learner at the end of the experiment and told that the learner was fine. So he still left the lab completely confused about what had happened and whether or not he really hurt the guy. So I could go on and on about the problems with the research, but once I started talking to people who took part and I started listening, particularly listening to those audio recordings, you hear a very different story from the official accounts. But then we're trained and we're taught as students of psychology to produce. I'm assuming it's the same today as when I did my undergrad and postgrad. You're taught to write in a certain way. You're taught to present data in a certain way. you can see in experiments like Stanley Milgram's.
If you had to look back and think of like a big takeaway from the experiments or from your research around the reality and the true history of the experiments, what would you say they teach us about human nature?
I don't think Milgram's experiments teach us much about human nature because we have a very restricted sample. We have very small numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think they captured something about a moment in history when it came to social psychological research. I think the big takeaway for me is how much the subjectivity of people who participate in experiments is overlooked, and it's seen as a bad thing. Subjectivity in psychological research is a no-no on the part of the experimenter, and it's excluded when it comes to the participants.
Yeah.
Their behaviour was measured, but they were never asked for their perceptions or their insights. And yet when I asked them, I got so much out of those people in terms of revelations about what we should be doing with research, what the problems with Milgram's experiments were. You know, there is, I suppose I'm going back to that idea of the superiority of the experimenter and the inferiority of the people who participate. That really stood out for me in Milgram's research, and he missed an amazing opportunity, because if he had actually used the perceptions of people in research to study obedience to authority or to study why people do things that conflict with their conscience, I think we would have had a much more nuanced and interesting piece of work. As it stands, it feels like a cardboard cutout. I think he turned his subjects into one-dimensional numbers, really. They became voltages on a machine. They became stand-ins for Nazi guards. You know, he denied their humanity and their individuality, and I hope my book has uncovered some of that and cast a different light on Milgram's research as a result.
I think it absolutely has, yeah. Just honestly, just seeing or hearing about an experiment from the participant perspective was so refreshing. It's so interesting. And I think you're absolutely right that there's such a wealth of information that is missed by trying to turn participation in a study like this into a yes or no, a one-dimensional box. You've been super, super generous with your time. We have one last question for you that we ask all of our participants, and that is, how do you take your coffee?
Well, your versions of coffee are very different to Australian ones. So, all right, I take my coffee, I take it as an extra hot latte.
Okay. Any flavors or foams in there that you like?
Oh, we're not really into flavours and foams in Australia, I'm very sorry to say. And Melbourne is regarded as the coffee capital of Australia.
That's nice.
So you could call us coffee snobs. So there would be some cafes in Melbourne who might not serve you if you asked for flavoured foam.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Oh, really? I would be kicked out.
So to be a true Melbourneite, you like your traditional kind of Italian coffees, I guess.
Okay.
Your espressos, your lattes, even a cappuccino is regarded as a little bit of a variation on the pure coffee.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Okay, well, it's been really lovely to meet you, and if you ever want to talk to me another time, I do have another book out.
I may or may not have ordered that already. It's wild.
Well, I think if you're interested in subject's perspective, this one is like a Lord of the Flies experiment.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll definitely be in touch.
Let's please schedule a second interview for that.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Sydney.
Yeah,
thank you. This was so interesting, and we definitely look forward to talking to you in the future.
It's been like a true pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thank you. It was lovely. Ciao for now.
Hey, Mal Pals. Thanks for listening. The sources and links for this episode can be found in our show notes. If you haven't already, go follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Malpractice Podcast. You can also send topic suggestions, questions, or concerns to our email, malpracticepodcast@gmail.com. And just as a reminder, if you like what you're hearing, you should definitely subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. And don't forget, malpractice makes perfect.